This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. I am one of those people who, if we see a body of water, we essentially have to jump in. On hot days when the beaches of Lake Champlain close because of algae blooms, I have to admit that my husband sometimes has to physically restrain me from getting in. It's not worth it, he tells me. And I logically know that that's true, but the call of the water is so intense sometimes. Later in the show, we're going to check in on Lake Champlain, the largest lake in our region. It borders New York, Vermont, and Quebec. There have long been concerns about pollution and algae blooms in its waters, but there are also a lot of people trying to keep it clean, and we'll hear from a couple of them. But first, we head north to Lake Memphremagog, a freshwater glacial lake between Newport, Vermont and Magog, Quebec. It's the primary drinking water source for around 200,000 Canadians. About three-quarters of the lake's surface area is in Canada, but three-quarters of its watershed is in Vermont. And all of the stuff flowing into that watershed causes some concern. Joining us today to tell us more is Antonio De Frucia. He's a member of the Memphremagog Conservation Inc., or MCI. Its goal is to conserve and improve Lake Memphremagog and its watershed. He was also a water treatment engineer in Quebec for 35 years. Antonio, welcome to Vermont Edition.
Hello, nice to be here.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you. And listeners, you can join the conversation as well. Do you live near Memphremagog in Canada or the US? How do you interact with the lake? And are you concerned about its water quality or not? Give us a call at 800-639-2211 in the first part of this hour. You can also send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. So, Antonio, your group, MCI, is part of an effort to designate Lake Memphremagog as a lake in crisis. There's even a bill in the Vermont legislature about this. What exactly would that designation accomplish?
Well, I think one of the most important concerns at, at MCI, and I think a lot of people that are in contact with the lake, is the fact of the presence of a landfill, the one and only landfill in Vermont. And
And that's in
this is the
Coventry.
one called Coventry,
Hmm.
not far from Newport. And the concern, obviously, is the contamination of the leachate uh, back into the watershed and eventually reaching out to the lake. So the presence of a landfill is always concerning. Back in Quebec, there was one landfill approximately 15, 20 years ago that was closed down. And so the fact that there is an operating landfill in Vermont is of utmost concerning, and so the bill itself would address that. As you mentioned, the lake serves as a water source for close to 200,000 Canadians. Uh, so the leachate contains many contaminants and many pollutants.
Can I ask
Uh,
you a quick question about this leachate? And I've reported a lot on the landfill in Coventry, which is run by Casella Waste Systems, and the folks there say that they're doing their absolute best to make sure that landfill is tightly it's double lined. They are piloting a new leachate treatment system that is supposed to
yeah.
take PFAS, these harmful chemicals, out of the leachate. And I think if you ask them, they would say, these harmful things are not making their way into Lake Memphremagog. Are you saying that there is data showing that leachate from the landfill is actively going into the lake, or is it a concern that that could happen in the future if there's a leak, for example?
Well, they've recent analysis in the groundwater underneath of the landfill. There is a presence of PFAS and other contaminants that do eventually reach out to the lake, um, and so the risk, the potential is always there, uh, as um, as uh, the fact regarding the treatment plant. This is a new technology that's being tested at the treatment plant, a pilot testing plant, which is supposed to remove PFAS. This is a new technology.
First of its
It's
kind in the US, I believe.
Yes, it's being pilot tested. The test itself, it's a 6-month period, which is relatively short, if you ask me. Um, has not begun yet. And so new technology, yes, very little, experience here in the U.S. and uh, and the performance, in other words, the removal of the PFAS, um, has yet to be determined. So it'll be as a function of what potentially the technology can remove. And so this remains obviously worrisome because ultimately, we might have a removal that is sufficient or not for the protection of the lake. In addition, there is also disposal of the residuals from the treatment plant. So all the PFAS that are removed from the leachate are concentrated and are encased in cement blocks, and these cement blocks are put back into the landfill. So again, very little is known long term what happens to these residuals that have been encased inside of cement.
Hmm.
So, um, so that's the concern. Yeah, there might be technology obviously needs to be tested, but I don't believe that it's the right uh, the right conditions where we're testing out a new technology in a landfill. In a landfill itself, it should have been tested maybe somewhere else, and after it's been proven for more than 6 months, then maybe there could be, discussions as to what, depending on the quality of leachate, if yes or not it is safe to be returned. But
Yeah, it's
until
tough
then,
though, right? Because nobody really wants to have this test occur in their community. So,
yeah,
it's hard to say, as I'm sure you know, that we don't want this tested here, but we want it tested somewhere else, perhaps near somebody else's, you know, ecosystem or drinking
yeah.
water.
Well, I believe until we're not, 100% sure of the performance and long-term success of these new technologies, I think it needs to be tested somewhere else completely,
Hmm.
and the residuals need to be disposed of, accordingly. You need to keep it away as much as possible from a vulnerable source,
Yeah.
such as the lake. The research and development. I mean, yeah, that's the it's very important. We need to advance in developing these technologies, but it needs to be done properly and safely, and we need to make sure that we're not bypassing, the regular way of determining and eventually making a technology proven, efficient, and so forth.
Mm.
So I feel that we've sort of short circuited a few things here, and that more testing needs to be done elsewhere.
Mm.
And once we're completely sure of the performance that this kind of technology can have, then maybe we can reconsider certain things. But
Is it okay if I jump in here? Because I want to
yeah,
get to a caller who has a question for you. We're speaking with Antonio de Frucia, who is a member of an organization based in Quebec that is working to conserve Lake Memphremagog and improve water quality there. We have Eric calling in from Plattsburgh, New York. Eric, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, yes, I'm kind of sorry. I was more directing toward the Lake Champlain question. I fly over the lake on a daily basis during the summer, and you can literally see a brown line that runs right up the middle of the lake. On the east side, it's brown. On the west side, it's black. And I just wonder, why is the pollution seemingly so much coming from the Vermont side and not the New York side? and why it seems so much more important that we take care of the west side of the lake, and the east side kind of gets neglected.
Okay, well, that's a great question. We're going to save that for when we discuss Lake Champlain later in the hour. But I think, Eric, you bring up a really interesting point about these lakes like Memphremagog and Lake Champlain that share borders, not just with multiple states, but multiple countries, in Memphremagog's case with the US and Canada. And Antonio, I'm wondering if you could speak to that a bit. Does that make it more complicated to figure out, whose job it is to care for this lake, knowing that it shares these international boundaries? How does that work?
Well, I mean, there's treaties in place, international treaties. When situations such as these arise, where a body of water is shared by two countries, and uh, and normally treaties like this, you need to have an open discussion on both sides and try to, understand the concerns on both sides. We have particular concerns, on the Canadian side. I'm sure Vermonters have their own proper concerns uh, in terms of air quality, in terms of groundwater, and how it may affect, um, the wells that many of these residents use as potable water. But yeah, I mean, it complicates issues.
Hmm.
And so yeah, you need to sit down with the proper authorities and lay out a plan on how to address concerns like this. Right now, I have a feeling that we're working sort of on each on our own side. I mean, Health Canada uh, issued last summer uh, drinking water standards for PFAS. And I know it's the same also in the US. The standards are not the same. And so when it comes to a body of water that is shared for two countries, it's, you know, you need to sit down and sort of harmonize and do things properly so that we're both uh, reassured, from that point of view.
Yeah.
But absolutely, yeah, it makes things more complicated. But again, treaties are in place, and discussions need to be had at the right, with the right authorities.
Right. So there's this 1909 boundary treaty between the US and Canada that requires both countries to prevent cross border environmental
Yeah.
harm, and also promote environmental justice. There is also, I believe, an organization. A steering committee, excuse me, with Quebec
Mhm.
that meets twice annually. That's kind of under the umbrella of Vermont's Agency of Natural Resources, and
Yes.
and the head of ANR, Julie Moore, testified earlier this month in the Vermont legislature that the state is already making all these investments in lake and watershed practices. The steering committee exists, and this lake in crisis designation isn't warranted because we're already doing a lot. But you're saying we do need to go as a step further. What exactly would this lake in crisis designation do?
Well, I think it would emphasize, um, the importance of the lake to Quebecers and to Vermonters, um, because of these new pollutants that, with analytical analysis, are being developed, and PFAS are everywhere in the environment. They're in the air,
Yeah.
in the soil, in the water, and they're particularly present in leachate. And so, we've addressed the issue of algae bloom, because of sources of pollution from phosphorus and nitrogen and so forth. And so, I mean, the control is there, and we're doing a pretty decent job in order to control the inputs of these pollutants. But we need to continually be up there in front of new contaminants that are posing different types of hazards. And so we can't just sit back and say, okay, fine, we've done a lot with phosphorus and nitrogen. Now we need to address other contaminants. And again, I go back to the fact that there is the only landfill in Vermont is located in Coventry, and this landfill is will it's up for expansion, so we're going to keep getting, the capacity will increase with time. And again, the technology is not proven yet, so we need to be really aware of this reality. And like I said, when Quebec closed down their only landfill, well, you know it's a landfill that's located on a lake, where discharge into a lake is certainly not the best. And so the Coventry landfill is something that needs to be corrected in sort of way, so that we're able to protect the lake. The landfill is there and will remain there, but we need to really, you know, the bill itself will permit much more discussions, and will permit to develop guidelines, and in order to upkeep and keep, to preserve the lake for future generations.
Hmm.
And so this is, I think this is what the bill will try to achieve. And we cannot wait either till till we when we've discharged too many of these internal, these pollutants that are forever in the environment. We need to be upfront and trying to address it as soon as we can,
Hmm.
because it might be too late, eventually, to do anything.
Right. Act
And again,
proactively.
yeah,
Yeah.
actively. And
Yeah.
again, keep in mind new regulations for drinking water, and the fact that it's 200,000 people in Quebec are using it as a water source. And so that's the fact that needs to be, underlined. And again, we haven't spoken about the fish. I mean,
I know.
fish
Antonio,
also are endangered
unfortunately,
because of
we're going
PFAS
to have to
leachates.
save that. Excuse me, Antonio. We're going to have to save that for our next conversation.
Yes.
But yes, there is a testimony in front of the Vermont Legislature's environmental committee about the effects that PFAS have on fish tissue and melanoma tumors, which you can read more about online. We'll make sure to link to some of those resources. Antonio De Frucia with the Memphremagog Conservation Incorporated, or MCI. They're based in Quebec. They are working across borders to protect Lake Memphremagog. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Coming up, we are going to head over to another lake with international boundaries, Lake Champlain. If you study the lake's ecosystems or spend a lot of time on it, boating, swimming, or fishing, and you have questions perhaps about when it's safe to recreate there, call in at 800-639-2211. We'll take those calls in just a minute on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Summer is the best time, in my humble opinion, to enjoy our region's lakes and ponds. It's also when we start to really notice the effects of pollution. For the rest of this hour, we're going to hone in on our region's largest lake, Lake Champlain. We usually check in on its ecology and water quality about once a year, usually during the height of summer when there are algae blooms and, more recently, extra runoff from flooding. This year, we figured we'd try to get ahead of things and talk about the lake when the water levels are high, the water temps are cool, and our fingers are still tightly crossed in the hopes of staving off flooding this summer. If you have questions about the water in Lake Champlain, like when it's safe for you or your pets to swim in it, give us a call at 800-639-2211. We are joined now by two experts on this beautiful and complex water body. Matthew Vaughn is the Lake Champlain Basin Program's chief scientist. The organization works with agencies in New York, Vermont, and Quebec to support the lake's water quality. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Michaela, thanks for having me.
We're also joined from Montpelier by Misha Setner, a lake and shoreline ecologist for the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Misha, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, how's the lake doing? Matt, what have you been working on? How are we looking? I was near the lake over the weekend, and it was so
Yeah.
inviting and beautiful looking and crisp and
And cold.
cold. Yes, still so cold. Yeah,
Yes,
but I put
was
my
there
feet in.
too. I was there too. It is looking beautiful and very inviting, and the water temperatures are cold. So
Yes.
I'll start off on that point. While the temperatures are lovely and in the 80s, I think today, the water temperature is very cold. So if you're thinking about venturing out, remember that hypothermia can set in quickly if you fall out of your boat. Make sure you're wearing a PFD and staying close to shore if you're not confident. That is kind of the number one message for the lake at this time of year is to remember that cold water can be a danger. But yeah, we had a really cold and snowy winter, which I was really psyched about as a skier. I really enjoyed it. And that has set us up for relatively colder water temperatures than we've seen in the past few years, or compared to the past few years. Although if you dipped your toes in this past weekend, it would have felt frigid. It's actually pretty close to average, or what we've seen over the past 100 years or so, as we've
That's
been
good to
measuring
hear.
in Burlington for a long time, right next to the Echo Museum. So what's interesting is that it feels very cold, but it's kind of what we expect for this time of year with snowmelt coming in. And if you compare it to last year was actually very, very high. It was about 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer
Wow.
on yesterday's date last year compared to yesterday. It was about 63 degrees Fahrenheit last year at this time, and yesterday it was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And what that does is sets us up for different types of years. So last year, we had a warmer spring, higher water temperatures, and we were set up for record high water temperatures in Burlington throughout the season. We actually had the highest ever temperature recorded in Burlington at 80 degrees Fahrenheit in early August. And I think it's 38 highest ever for the date record set last year alone. So it was really warm year for water temperatures last year. This year, we're cooler, right around average, but it's kind of a relief from the trend we're seeing with climate change.
Wow. Okay, so Misha, you're a lake and shoreline ecologist with the Vermont state government. What are your takeaways from what Matt is describing here about the effects of this very cold winter on the lake's ecosystem health and water temps and quality?
Yeah, so overall, the colder water temperatures are really going to impact the biology of this lake system, mostly by slowing it down. As Matt noted, we've had some warmer springs, but now we're actually it's a cooler spring, which apparently is more average to the past 100 years. But really, what that does, it slows down aquatic plants starting their growing season, as well as impacting the spring fish spawning season. And so spring fish spawning is temperature dependent, and so that spawning season is going to be delayed a little bit longer, and so that'll push further into the early summer. Typically, that'll taper off around July 1st.
Well, let's take a call here. We have our caller from our first segment, Eric in Plattsburgh, who kindly offered to stay on the line. Eric, remind us, you were calling in about something you've noticed about the color of the water in this lake. What was your question?
Yeah, so I fly out of southern Vermont quite often. I'm over the lake a lot, and as especially as the summer goes on, you'll notice a brown side, the east side of the lake, and a black side, the west side of the lake. And yeah, you can see that line heading all the way up toward Burlington from pretty much the Lake Champlain Bridge near Ticonderoga there. And I just wonder, why is there such a distinction, and why does it seem like New York takes better care of the lake?
Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. That's a great question, and I always love flying over the lake too. It's always a beautiful, beautiful scene. Yeah, what you're seeing is likely sediment being delivered to our lake from our major rivers. It's a natural process for rivers to deliver, not only water but also sediment, which is just sand and dirt, really, and along with that, nutrients and possibly other pollutants. So that's something we work on to reduce the amount of sediment because it can carry pollutants and nutrients that can impact water quality. When you're seeing a line like that, it's likely could be after a rainstorm. We have sediment plumes that are visible from a boat or from the air. And then the water currents and wind can move that around. It's not necessarily because of one part of the watershed taking better care of the lake versus another, but we do have differences across our region. Vermont makes up about half of our watershed. We have an over 8,000 square mile watershed. It's about 8 times as much land compared to the amount of lake surface. So all that land contributes water, sediment, pollutants, nutrients to the lake. Roughly half of that is in Vermont, and about 37% of it is in New York. And it's a very different landscape because the New York side is largely part of the Adirondack Park. It's a lot of forested area and not as many direct water quality concerns. And so there's just different challenges on different sides of the lake. And part of what the Lake Champlain Basin Program does is bring all of those partners together to address those challenges as one team.
Well, thanks, Eric, for calling in and for staying on the line with us. We also have Charlotte in Stowe. Charlotte, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Charlotte. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, what is your question or your comment?
So my comment is actually dialing back to Antonio's presentation and telling us about the good work that he's doing in Lake Memphremagog. And my comment is, I've been swimming up open water marathon swimming in Lake Memphremagog since 2009. And I'm horrified and alarmed at the decline in the water quality, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years. Bleaching on the rocks of the side of the lake, white scum on, not so much scum, but bubbles on top of the water that never used to be there. And it's alarming that there is a landfill at the head of such an incredible natural resource, which is also drinking water to, a couple of 100,000 people, our neighbours in Quebec. And, I'd strongly urge the state to not wait for analytical statistics and move into action station in addition to that now, because really the thought is it's already too late. The lake is on a decline and it needs help.
Charlotte, thank you for calling in. So it sounds like you spend a lot of time swimming in Lake Memphremagog, which is the lake we were focused on in the first segment of this hour. Misha, you're with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Are you focused on lakes all around the state to address concerns like the ones that Charlotte is bringing up, or is your work mostly focused on Lake Champlain, which we're discussing now?
Yeah, so my work is focused on all lakes and ponds within the state. So overall, there's around over 800 lakes and ponds within the state, 400 of which are over 10 acres in size. And so the work that we do in my program regarding like restoration efforts, we have all sorts of activities that the public can get involved with to address some of these concerns that are being voiced. And so those activities include kind of a more community-based approach called Lake Watershed Action Plans, where interested parties within a lake's watershed get together to work at identifying threats to water quality or wildlife habitat. And at the end of that planning process, typically results in a prioritized list of threats and then projects that can be done to address those threats. And then once those projects are implemented, in the long term, those result in benefits to water quality and wildlife habitat. And so there's quite a number of those that are occurring throughout the state that have been completed and quite a number of others that are in the works right now. So that's a community-based approach. And then our program also has what we call the Lake-Wise program. And that's more of an individual approach to address some of these threats to water quality and wildlife habitat. Where the Lake-Wise program, we offer the public an ability to sign up for this program to have your property, your lakeshore property, assessed to see if it's lake-wise. And lake-wise means whether or not your property has been developed in a lake-friendly manner. And when we say lake-friendly, we mean the property's has been developed so that things like nutrients and sediment runoff are managed accordingly, so they don't just run right off right into the water, and things like shoreline habitat. Trees, forested areas are still present and along that shoreline because in all, having stormwater managed along the shoreline, in addition to having native trees and shrubs along that shoreline, really help to benefit water quality and wildlife habitat.
Well, that's good to hear because I'm guessing a lot of our listeners might have questions about what individuals can do to support the lake and how much of an impact that actually has. And Matt, I'm hoping you could speak to this. How much does the work of folks like Misha who are trying to work with individual property owners along the lake affect the water quality when you're also thinking about the massive effects of, say, a very large dairy farm, or another a large municipal sewage system, something like that?
Yeah. So something we like to say among our partners is that we're all in this together. This is a very big problem that's been mounting for over 100 years, probably more than 150 years, and we've really given it the attention it needs just in the past few decades. So we have a long way to go to meet our water quality goals. There's a lot of work going on, Misha's team at the state, with federal partners and other municipalities and everyone that the Lake Champlain Basin Program works with. So there's a lot of investment and successes that have happened in recent years. But folks like all you listening out there can do a lot to help the lake as well. Some of the things we like to remind people to do is to clean, drain, and dry your boating equipment when you're entering a lake or any lake, including Champlain, and when you're leaving it, making sure to not transport aquatic invasive species, which can be a real detriment to our ecosystems and water quality. When you're fertilizing your lawn, make sure you're only giving it the nutrients that it needs and do not use phosphorus with that fertilizer, because we're trying to limit the amount of phosphorus that makes its way to the lake. When you're de-icing your driveway and walkways around your property, try to use as little as possible and understand how de-icing salts work. It doesn't, sodium chloride or the normal salt that most people use doesn't work when the temperature is below a certain threshold, about 16 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is an issue we're seeing now where due to de-icing salt application, our lake is getting saltier. And that's an issue we're kind of tracking closely. And then folks can also volunteer with your local watershed group, plant trees, pick up trash along the river. All that stuff is a great way to get outside and get engaged with your local waterway. I could go on and on.
Well, let's pause here for a short break. But when we come back, I want to hear more ways that individuals can support the lake's water quality. And I also want to hear a little bit more about the kind of cool stuff that's happening at this season in the lake, particularly around the fish. This is a time when our fish species get a little frisky, and it's extra important to take care of their habitats. We're going to take one more break here. If you have questions or comments, you can still call in at 800-639-2211 as we address water quality in Lake Champlain on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are spending the hour today discussing water quality in some of our region's largest lakes. Right now, we're focused on Lake Champlain, which has shoreline in New York, Quebec, and Vermont. Our guests are Matthew Vaughn, the Lake Champlain Basin Program's chief scientist, and Misha Setner, a lake and shoreline ecologist for the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. All right, so springtime is an important time for the fish species in Lake Champlain. Misha, I know this is something that your department is focused on, the supporting of fish as they spawn. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on in those waters right now?
Yeah, so right now during the spring fish spawning season, you've got fish laying egg masses, and once those egg masses hatch, you've got fish fry that are out there. They're very small and very susceptible to impacts from like turbidity or any kind of physical disruption to that environment. And so when we work with the public on projects that are happening in and around lakes and ponds, we often have restrictions on when projects can occur. So typically, like I said earlier, for a cooler spring, you're going to see the fish spawning period last until around July 1st. And so through our permitting process, we typically don't allow for projects to occur before July 1st to be protective of that spawning period. In addition, we really like to support habitat for fish species. And habitat, comes down to aquatic plants being in the water. And you'll notice I said aquatic plants, not weeds. That's something, really try to emphasize to folks that when you look in the water and see all that stuff growing in there, that's really beneficial. You really want to have aquatic plants in that water body because it's not only really beneficial to the fish spawning period, but also for habitat for fish and then for water quality benefits. Because having that massive aquatic plants in there really helps to minimize erosive wave energy and dissipate out fine particulate matter in the water column.
Matt, you had some news to share about our fish species in the region as well, right?
I do, yeah. It's some exciting success stories. One is that lake trout in Lake Champlain is really making a comeback. The lake trout is a species that it's stocked to increase the numbers for people to enjoy as part of our fishery. And recently, the Fish Management Cooperative for Lake Champlain decided to decrease and then eventually end stocking for lake trout because the wild population is doing so well at reproducing. So that is a kind of a historic landmark as lake trout are doing great in our lake.
And I just want to note here that our environment reporter Abigail Giles recently went out on a boat with some lake scientists to learn more about the lake trout populations, and we'll link to her story in the show notes for today's show.
Awesome. Yeah. Great. And the other thing I want to mention is the work to reconnect habitat for our Atlantic salmon and other species that, as part of their life cycle, want to move up and down the river to spawn and to live out their lives. And because of habitat fragmentation with dams being built, they haven't had access to the habitat for hundreds of years. And due to some recent work by Lake Champlain Basin Program and our partners at the state and watershed groups, there were 2 dams removed on the Saranac River. And that's getting things lined up for when the Imperial Mills Dam, which is the largest one just upstream of the mouth of the Saranac River, is removed. Next year, it'll reconnect nearly 20 miles of habitat that salmon have not had access to since the American Revolution.
Wow.
So a huge win for our Atlantic salmon.
Wow. So Vermont's housing crisis extends to the fish as well. Well, that's great to hear. It's good to hear some happy news in this realm. I want to get to a couple of listener questions that we received in our inbox ahead of today's show, including one from a listener named Taylor, who said they're a St. Albans resident and a longtime lake goer. Taylor writes, I have had a burning question ever since learning about oyster mushrooms' capability for environmental cleanup. Micromediation is the use of mushrooms to clean the environment. Studies by the EPA, the University of Washington, and more have all shown significant E. coli reductions in lab settings, with some results showing over 95% reduction. And they want to know if our guests are aware of any active projects using mushrooms or other natural methods to help clean our lake. And could this research scale up to lake-size applications? Well, Misha, I'll throw that one to you first. Have you heard of oyster mushrooms helping to clean our lake?
No, that's a first for me. I've heard of all sorts of different approaches, unique approaches over the years. But I think really the most important one for the immediate shoreline is to get native trees and shrubs back along our shorelines. That includes lake shorelines, streams, rivers, having more of a natural buffer along these lakes and ponds really helps to build resilience to that shoreline so that sediments from the landscape stay on the landscape and not wash into our lakes and ponds.
Okay, so you're saying trees and shrubs first. Maybe we'll get to the oyster mushrooms next.
Yes.
Matt, have you heard of this?
I haven't heard of this directly, but I've heard of kind of alternative ideas like this, and I appreciate the question, Taylor. I just wanted to talk about kind of E. coli a little bit as a concern, because a lot of what we're talking about with Lake Champlain's water quality and when beaches are closed is cyanobacteria, which is a related but separate issue from E. coli. So when we have a cyanobacteria bloom, that's when you're seeing colonies of cyanobacteria kind of form a surface scum or a green, visible impact to the water. E. coli is a little bit different. It's not something you can see. Typically, we have challenges with E. coli, or we call it coliform bacteria, after a heavy rainstorm, and those can close beaches, although it's not as common as other water quality concerns. Overall, looking at the numbers, about 95% of our days over the past 3 years on public beaches were open for swimming with no water quality concerns. About 4% of the days had closures because of cyanobacteria blooms, and less than 2% were due to E. coli concerns or this bacterial pollution. So I really appreciate the idea. I'm going to look into this oyster mushroom idea. And the best way to reduce E. coli concerns is by addressing our stormwater and wastewater systems that can be overloaded during heavy rainstorms, picking up after your pets, which can be a source of bacteria, and also our wildlife, seagulls and other, or domesticated animals can contribute to E. coli counts as well. So in St. Albans Bay, E. coli can be an issue, but is not the main concern at that location.
Okay. Well, our next question is about Mallett's Bay. It comes from a listener named Marilyn who lives in Colchester. She wrote in with concerns about the water quality in Mallett's Bay and cited a water quality report by the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation from 2022 that says, quote, "The inland sea and Mallett's Bay continue to show signs of deep water hypoxia in late summer." And Marilyn wants to know if you could please explain what deep water hypoxia is and what is being done to be sure this problem doesn't get worse in Mallett's Bay. Well, since she's referencing a DEC report, Misha, let's start with you. Can you talk to us about deep water hypoxia?
Yeah, I'm assuming that report is referring to anoxic conditions forming at the lower levels of the lake.
Anoxic, no oxygen?
Correct. Anoxic, no oxygen. That's what I'm assuming the report is referring to. I'm not specifically familiar with the report that's being cited. But in terms of what's being done, that's a fairly complicated issue when anoxic conditions do form. It can be a fairly complicated interaction between chemical and biological conditions of a lake. Thermal stratification. If folks ever dive into a lake, you'll notice that the surface level is nice and warm, but you might dive down and suddenly you'll hit a cold layer. Those thermal layers create unique conditions with water chemistry sometimes and how it interacts with the lake bed. So overall, it's a fairly complicated question and condition to manage.
Is it bad? Like, is deep water hypoxia something you want not to be happening?
What can happen is it can result in conditions that phosphorus from the lake bed can be released into the water column. And then when that happens, and that thermal stratification starts to go away, typically you might see more cyanobacteria blooms kind of around the late summer when that thermal stratification starts to weaken. And so when that happens, you might start to see some of this more phosphorus-rich water from down below start to make its way up to the surface levels, where that will be, that phosphorus is then used by cyanobacteria to form a bloom in that late summer season. So that's how those interactions can kind of play with each other and result in a potential negative impact. But this thermal stratification, it's a natural process. Cyanobacteria, they're natural native species. It just becomes more of a concern when a system might be supercharged with phosphorus. More phosphorus in that system than what would naturally be there.
And Matt, do you have thoughts on Marilyn's question here?
Yep, I think Misha set it up really, really nicely, and I'll just build on it. You can think of a lake that's stratified, as Misha said, as kind of having two layers of a cake. You have the warmer, less dense layer sitting on top of the deeper, colder layer, and depending on how much the water is mixing, the surface usually has a lot of oxygen in it. But over time, throughout the summer, if that water is not mixing, if there's not windy days, and there are things living along the bottom of the lake that's using up that oxygen. So over time, there can be the hypoxic or low oxygen condition. And as Misha said, we have we call it legacy phosphorus in the lake, where this is phosphorus that's been deposited there over tens of years or more. And when there's low oxygen level there, it can be released into the water column, as Misha said. So that's one of the reasons why we're concerned when there's low oxygen levels at the bottom of the lake. So the longer that period of hypoxia is, or longer there's lower oxygen, the more likely it may be released, the phosphorus may be released and fuel those cyanobacterial blooms. And also, hypoxia is not good for our fish and wildlife either.
Matt, I know there's a lot of research being done to track phosphorus and other nutrients, how they make their way into the lake. And that is a lot easier to do in the summer compared to the winter. But I saw that there was some new research that came out just this past winter that was supported by the Lake Champlain Basin Program that showed what happens to phosphorus during the winter and how they move through the landscape, even when much of that landscape is frozen. What did that research find?
Yeah, that's right. So just backing up a little bit, we since the early 1990s, we've been taking samples of all of our major rivers for phosphorus and other nutrients, key things we're looking at for water quality. And from this, and also measuring how much water is moving downstream into the lake, we can estimate how much phosphorus and sediment and nitrogen and all these things we care about, how much is moving into the lake on any given day and throughout any given year, going back to the early 1990s. But as you said, the winter is a tricky time. It's harder to get out in the field safely. Things are frozen over. There's other concerns like that. So the winter has been kind of a knowledge gap for us, where we don't have quite as much data. And in the early 1990s, throughout the early 2000s, the thinking was that the winter was not a very active time for these pollutants to be moving downstream. But with climate change, with the patterns of precipitation we're seeing, where more precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow in the winter, we're having more rain on snow events, which can cause flooding and really high loads for our rivers. We're understanding that winter is a very important and dynamic time for water and nutrients and pollutants moving downstream. So we partner with the University of Vermont, a really great team there, to focus in on the winter period and see what we're missing. They were able to use, we call them high-frequency water quality sensors. These are things that measure water quality at very high rates every 15 minutes rather than maybe once a week when a person can get out there with a bottle. And they're helping us fill that gap of what's moving downstream. So we're still in the process of kind of incorporating their data and seeing how our estimates of the winter period compare to their measurements.
That's exciting research.
Yeah.
Excited to keep following that as well. Misha, in the time we have left, I'm wondering if you might be able to provide some resources for folks who live, maybe they own property or rent near Lake Champlain, have heard you talking about what needs to be done to protect our shorelines, and want to learn more. Where should they head?
Yeah, if you want to learn more, we have a number of volunteer opportunities for several different programs. The first one is the Lay Monitoring Program. That's a volunteer water quality monitoring program that's primarily focused on lakes and ponds. And so with that program, you can get out, be trained to get out on the water and take water quality samples, which then those samples then are analyzed by our lab and help inform us as to what the baseline is for water quality parameters. In addition, there's the La Rosa Partnership Program. It's a similar water quality monitoring program, but their volunteers are focused on streams and rivers. So those are kind of like two water quality monitoring programs where folks can get involved. And then there's also the cyanobacteria monitoring program. And that's a collaborative between the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and the Department of Health. That is where folks are trained to monitor for cyanobacteria and then to report that on the I think it's called the cyano tracker. And so that is it's an active map that shows where blooms, cyanobacteria blooms, are occurring in the state, as well as the severity of that bloom. And then there's another program called the
We're
Vermont
almost out of
Invasive
time here.
Okay, the last one's the Vermont Invasive Patrollers, and that's another volunteer program where you can get trained to get out on the water to survey for aquatic plants and specifically learn the difference between native aquatic plants and invasive aquatic plants, and then report those results, survey results, back to us.
Lots of ways to volunteer and support our lakes and ponds. Misha Setner is a lake and shoreline ecologist with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Misha, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
And Matthew Vaughn is the Lake Champlain Basin Program's chief scientist.
Thanks, Michaela.
Always great to have you on. All right, that is all the time we have for today. Our show is directed by Aaliyah Papes. Our producers are John Ahrens, Andrea Lorian, and Daniela Fierro, and our call screener is Rick Barrett. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.
The Afghan Women of Brattleboro is a new podcast presented by Vermont Public. The series follows a group of women who evacuated from Afghanistan after the Taliban seized power in 2021 and had to forge a new path for themselves in southern Vermont.
It was not easy for me to begin like a different life in here, but I started.
All 6 episodes are available now wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for Vermont Public Docs and subscribe.